People in New York in the midst of a huge and crushing blackout, heading for the shoreline and ferry boats home in a picture evocative of a much darker day in this city's history. The difference, this is what officials are saying, is the result of natural causes. The tripping of power systems for hundreds of miles in several big cities today, and the interior of those cities has now tripped into darkness this evening.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Substituting tonight, Brian Williams.
It is only thanks to emergency generators and a whole lot of scrambling here that we are able to say this Thursday night, good evening from our NBC News headquarters in Midtown Manhattan, where we are in the midst of what appears to be a colossal and history-making blackout. Not just this city, but to massive points north and west, as far west as Cleveland, Ohio, and as far north as the Canadian cities of Ottawa and Toronto. The city of Detroit affected. Their airport, the first major metropolitan air center to shut down. Akron, Ohio. New York's capital city of Albany, on west to Syracuse. As far south as some of the residential sections of the state of New Jersey. And certainly all of this city and outlying boroughs, and that means thousands of subway riders in the middle of dark tunnels, people stuck in elevators, trapped across this city in ways they haven't been since the first colossal blackout of the modern age in 1965. We should say early and often here in this broadcast tonight that officials from state, local, and federal agencies are saying this is not the result of any kind of terroristic act. Rather, what they prefer to call a natural cause, a power system that failed and took a whole lot of others with it. The street scene in 6th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, right outside our headquarters. No traffic lights. 6th Avenue is left to become a pedestrian mall. Those commuters wanting to get home are crowding to the shoreline if the Hudson River is their route. Otherwise, a whole lot of hotel and motel reservations in the New York metropolitan area tonight, and all those areas affected. A look at what has happened to this massive area today. Here is NBC's Lisa Myers.
Brian, the massive power outage hit New York City shortly after 4 o'clock this afternoon and encompassed parts of at least 6 states and Canada, impacting tens of millions of people. This was the scene in New York City. After the power went out, thousands of people simply decided to start walking. With traffic lights out, some pedestrians directed traffic. Those on the ground reported frustration but no panic. In fact, some New Yorkers treated the inconvenience with good humor. The most immediate concern was for thousands believed to be stranded underground in the dark in the New York subway system or in elevators in skyscrapers. New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg said the city has remained calm, and so far there are no reports of injuries.
The police are saying that the evacuation procedures are working, people are calm, and that they are getting out.
Reports so far indicate the power outage hit the cities of New York, Albany, and Syracuse, Detroit, Cleveland, Akron, Toledo, Hartford, Connecticut, as well as the Canadian cities of Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal.
There is no evidence of any terrorism whatsoever. For some reason or other, there was a power failure in northern New York or southern Canada that cascaded down through the system and affected the power grid as far east as Connecticut, as far south as New Jersey, and as far west as Ohio.
Power officials say they believe the outage was caused by the overload and subsequent failure of the Niagara-Mohawk power grid. The grid affects 84,000 miles of power lines. A short time ago, Mayor Bloomberg said the power is beginning to come back on, but that it will take a while, perhaps many hours, Brian.
Lisa Myers in Washington. Thanks to Rahema Ellis, who is with us by telephone from Midtown Manhattan, where reporters all during the day have given us eyewitness accounts pretty much along the lines of Lisa Myers' report. No evident panic, a lot of people helping each other, as has always been the case when New York has been hobbled by a crisis like this. Yes, there were early fears that this was part of the new reality we were all living with and living under since September 11th. But once New Yorkers heard via their subway motorman, their bus driver, or the person in their building urging them to withdraw quickly but safely, they were going on about their business this afternoon, and for some it meant a brisk walk. Others, as you've seen, have decided to pause alongside a fountain in Midtown Manhattan. Rahima Ellis, Ashley Banfield is the next correspondent we will go to as we endeavor to cover this our level best. She is at the now familiar plaza outside here at Rockefeller Plaza. Ashley, how are things out there?
Brian, it's not often that we come to you by a cell phone, but there have been so many glitches in communication today. You see everybody walking down the streets, Times Square, Midtown Manhattan, everywhere, trying to make phone calls. It took us over an hour just to get one signal through. Buildings were evacuated, so clearly there were hundreds and hundreds of people on the streets. Sidewalks spilled over into the roadways. Traffic police were trying to clear people off the roads so that ambulances and cars and police cars could get through. We also know that ATM machines aren't working throughout New York, and we learned a story from two men who said they were planning to walk all the way to LaGuardia Airport because they'd heard that ATMs work at LaGuardia. We also know that there are people streaming out of Manhattan, walking across the bridges, of course, an image that was reminiscent of 9/11. But for the most part, Brian, people are really taking this in stride. We do not see anything like the panic we saw on 9/11. Most people just sort of annoyed and frustrated. Most of the shops have been closed down, especially all throughout Times Square. We spoke with one manager of an electronics and camera store who said he was very concerned about looting, brought down the steel shutter over the front of his windows. We spoke with a McDonald's manager, actually a regional operations manager, who said they were shutting the doors and staying inside, watching outside to make sure people didn't break the windows to come in. Also, Broadway shows, all the lights in Times Square, all out. So lines of tourists are outside of the Broadway shows being told there'll be no show tonight. Most people milling about wondering what to do.
We've apparently done a good job at keeping for a while communications with Ashley Banfield from just below our level in this building. But with the power out, we are doing our level best to get these reports from our correspondents in New York. To the West Coast we go, and correspondent George Lewis standing by in our NBC News Los Angeles bureau. George, the view from there tonight.
Yeah, Brian, we feel your pain. You know, we've had power blackouts here in the West Coast a couple of years ago, caused primarily by shortages of power and some energy companies manipulating the market. Today's outage in the East appears to have been caused by equipment failures spreading throughout major portions of the eastern power grid. If one generator goes out, the others pick up the slack, at least in theory. There are three major grids in this country, in the East, in the West, and a separate one that serves Texas. And while they've been generally dependable, they sometimes have an Achilles heel. A failure in one place can trip circuit breakers in other locations, creating a domino effect as circuit after circuit goes offline. That's what happened in previous New York City blackouts. Officials said they'd put safeguards in place so that it wouldn't happen again, but it did. Here in California, officials who run this state's power grid were asked if it could happen here. Fred Fletcher of Burbank, California's city-owned power company.
Outage probably occurred on one or two transmission lines that caused others then to subsequently fail.
And the problem is, he says, that no matter how high-tech you go, how many electronic safeguards you put in, how many computers go online, it can still happen when you have high heat and heavy demands on the grid, especially in more than one place. If the grid is near maximum in, say, New York City and Cleveland or Detroit, if there are failures in multiple points, it can cause everything to go offline. Now, the power failures here in California a few years ago have been somewhat alleviated by the fact that we've been building more power plants out west. The power outages have actually been a factor in the current recall drive against California Governor Gray Davis. They happened on his watch. He underwent a crash program of building new power plants now. The power grid here seems to be in better shape. Davis is not in politically good shape, but his problems were man-made. The problems back east may be just mechanical. Brian?
George Lewis in our Los Angeles bureau as we take it back to New York here, where like other office buildings throughout the city, the temperature rapidly rising now as we had a 90-degree plus summer hot August day, and now no air circulating. Everyone is in the same boat. Those offices with any lights on or power at all are running off emergency generators. They have been ordered to be emptied of employees, and that now familiar shot across the Hudson River as we approach the sunset hours here in New York. If that ferry appears to be moving at warp speed in the foreground, it is. All of the Cross Hudson River ferries are packing as many people as they can and traversing the river as quickly as they can. There is the street scene outside the familiar Today Show studios on the plaza in New York. A word here about the scope of what we are covering tonight. This is a blackout of massive and historic terms. From Ottawa, Canada, far to the north, west to Detroit, where the Detroit Metro Airport shut down early on in this, while other airports were still open at pilot's discretion. Then came word that we had lost power in Cleveland, Ohio. A lot of the state of New Jersey is completely down, as is the state of Connecticut. New York's capital of Albany went out early as well with the failure of the major system. And of course, the entire island of Manhattan, all the outlying boroughs, that is, a lot of the streets and highways in New York have become de facto pedestrian malls. This will get very dicey when night falls in this city with no street lights or traffic lights. A lot of people, especially unfamiliar with New York. This is the height of the summer tourist season, and quite a welcome they're receiving from the city of New York. To repeat, that is the Weehawken Ferry across the Hudson to New Jersey. 20,000 people left for that ferry on foot and arrived there to learn that they were all going to divide up among two boats running today. One major ferry line is not using the Hudson River. To our Washington bureau we go, and NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams. Pete, early on, you were among the first to reassure us what you were hearing from federal officials, that this is what folks in the power business call natural causes and not what everyone was concerned about early.
Exactly right, and the Department of Homeland Security was literally checking in the dark to see if that was the case, but they say again tonight there is no indication that terrorism was in any way involved in this massive blackout, and that's the consensus, too, of the FBI and other law enforcement agencies.
The Federal Aviation Administration grounded all planes waiting for takeoff at the three main New York area airports, LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark. Airports in Cleveland and in Canada at Ottawa and Toronto were also added to that list. Planes in the air had the option of landing at those airports, but planes on the ground at other airports scheduled to go to those cities could not take off. Homeland Security officials say they have no idea when they'll know the exact cause of the power blackout. Tracing the point of failure involves sending signals over power lines bit by bit and then dispatching crews to check for problems.
While officials are relieved that there is no indication of terrorism, they are concerned at how widespread this failure went and how quickly it spread, despite systems that were intended to prevent such a cascading outage. One official says tonight this does expose a potential vulnerability, Brian.
And Pete, there are tapes of 1965, that fateful night in the city of New York. Then President Lyndon Johnson calling his aide at the White House saying, "Don't tell me that this all went out without some sort of sabotage." He didn't believe it. Here we are looking at the same system failing and then some with all the advances society has made in intervening years. Think of how much of our lives run off electricity. Does this say anything about what's supposed to be the fail-safes along the line?
Yes, it says that as these systems get more complex, they also develop more vulnerabilities. One of them is to the extent that power companies depend on the internet. That's a concern. There have been at least 2 committees appointed by the federal government to look at what is dryly called the nation's infrastructure. And this is something they come back to over and over and over again, at how a relatively simple event can quickly spread and affect so many people. And it's another reminder, they're saying.
Pete, as people were scurrying through lobbies and streets here in New York today, there was a period of several minutes when what we did not know far outweighed what we did. How does the federal government and its vast and many tentacles reach out to find out where the problem is, how far it extends, and who knows what?
Well, first of all, we have a Department of Homeland Security now that we didn't the last time it happened, and they've been in touch with all the city mayors and governors affected, asking if they want any help, and we're told tonight there haven't been any requests. No one's asked for the National Guard or anything like that. One question is, how do they screen airplanes for now? Do they let people go into the secure areas if they can hand wand them, or do they hold everybody back because they can't x-ray bags? That's something Homeland has to decide. The Ambassador Bridge that goes from Detroit into Canada is open, we're told, with backup power. So it's been largely a matter of working the telephones to find out what cities want, what they need, and right now they're saying to the federal government, hang tight, we really don't need anything right now.
Pete Williams in our Washington Bureau will be coming back to you, I'm sure, throughout the evening as we have all afternoon long. Pete, for now, thanks. Rahema Ellis is not far from the 59th Street Bridge in Manhattan, I am told, and she can give us some perspective of life on the streets of New York this hot summer evening with no power. Rahema, good evening to you.
Good evening, Brian. Rush hour in New York is famous for gridlock, but tonight it has a virtual standstill. I want to pan the camera over a little bit so you can see what's happening in the street. If you would move over just a little bit, folks, people are literally walking out of the city of New York today if they can. They are not just on the sidewalks, but in the middle of the street. It is locking up the traffic unbelievably. The cars are everywhere. All is choked down in this city. It's been an incredible experience here from when the lights went out early on. That meant the traffic lights went out. Early on, when I walked about 3/4 of a mile away from Rockefeller Center, what I saw was people being incredibly courteous to one another. About 10 or 12 cars would pass down the street and they would stop and then allow the cars to pass in the opposite direction. People could hardly believe what was happening, but one thing that happened was there was no panic in the street. One of the reasons I believe is because many people were able to tune into radios, transistor radios, or to car radios, and they heard that what was happening here was a power outage. That relieved them tremendously from any sort of fear that there might be some sort of a terrorist threat. Not that, but a power outage. So they were extremely courteous. People were also prepared. One woman I talked to, I asked, how did she get out of one of the high-rise buildings? She said she had a flashlight. It's part of her emergency kit that she carries to work with her and everywhere she goes in New York City, because she was here on September 11th, and she is never without it. Other people trying to get home. I saw a man, he had written a sign of Westchester, trying to get someone on the street just to pick him up and take him to the county north of New York City. I think he might have gotten a ride because people were being incredibly courteous. The police tell me at Precinct House 17, a detective told me that when the lights went out, they got flooded with phone calls. Primarily people saying that they were stuck in elevators. So what they did was they immediately mobilized people and the fire departments to those various high-rise buildings. And they mobilized their officers to some key intersections to try and control the traffic. In addition, they said they sent officers to vulnerable spots, to the United Nations, to Wall Street, to the Empire State Building, to bridges. Because at first, they didn't know exactly what was going on, and they wanted to try and make certain they were at the key vulnerable spots in the city. But once again, Brian, there are hundreds of thousands of people making a mass exodus out of this city tonight. Many of them are on foot. It is all happening in as orderly a way as it can when you have traffic that is clogged like it is here today. A lot of it is at a standstill, but there is not the panic. And people are being, I think, as courteous as they can be, considering what the circumstances are. Brian?
NBC's Rahema Ellis at the foot of the 59th Street Bridge on the east side of Manhattan tonight. Will be coming back to you. And such an important point that the emergency kits that were urged on all Americans by the Department of Homeland Security that came out of the tragedy of 9/11 proving tonight to come in handy as we cover this colossal power outage that stretches from the furthest reaches of the East Coast all the way west to Cleveland, Ohio, and all the way north to Ottawa, Canada, and beyond. You'll notice Hartford, Connecticut, much of the state of Connecticut, totally in the dark, at least the interior spaces. That would include Union Station in New Haven. That is where Annie Rourke is from our NBC station WVIT there. Annie, what's the situation in New Haven at this hour?
Well, Brian, is much the same story here in Connecticut as you see in other areas. 182,000 people are without power right now. For the most part, those are people that are closer to New York in Fairfield County in the southwest section of Connecticut, but we have had reports of people having problems all the way up into Hartford. People along the shoreline took a very big power hit. The power went down, then came back up again, went down again, and then came back up. And for the most part, at this point, it is staying steady right there. Now, here at Union Station, the trains are not moving at all. It is at a complete standstill, and that is a real problem for Connecticut because hundreds of thousands of commuters go in and out of New York every day, and we're told there are thousands of people that are stranded in trains on the tracks right now. Now, what they are doing is actually taking diesel train equipment from another rail line, Shoreline East, and shipping that down closer to Metro North, closer to New York to try and fix those trains, get those people off the trains, get them to a station where they can get some help. Now, a lot of people are stranded here at Union Station. We've seen people with their luggage just dragging their luggage along the streets looking for hotels. Obviously, the taxis are doing a great service and the buses are just packed, but unfortunately, they are not going down into New York at all. Another problem that we're seeing is cell phone usage. A lot of people are trying to use their cell phones and they've just been busy. They're really not working at all. But we are seeing some of that famous American ingenuity when people are faced with adversity. People are getting together, they're finding people who are going to their same destination, and they're carpooling together. They are renting cars to try and get to where they need to go tonight. The mood here, really not too bad. People are trying to keep their sense of humor. They are starting to get a little frustrated, but they know that they just have to settle in for a long night until we hear some information. Brian?
Annie Rourke of WVIT. She is in New Haven for us tonight. We're looking at live pictures of what continues to be the human exodus off of the island of Manhattan tonight. They are headed across the very hot 59th Street Bridge. That is the very same location where we just spoke with Rahema Ellis. And note the common thread in so much of our coverage tonight: what is old is new again. Suddenly ferry boats are back in vogue. Trains are running on diesel engines. It's going to occur to someone to invent paper mail to make up for email, till they realize that's been around for a good long time as well. Rahema Ellis, if you can still hear me, are you getting any stories out of the New York subway system? That, of course, has been the chief concern all day long. Thousands of people in long, dark tunnels with only the information from the PA, from the motorman of their trains. All right, apparently we've lost touch with Rahema Ellis, things being what they are in New York. How about correspondent Robert Bazell on the streets of the city? Robert, are you with us? Not yet. We'll continue to tell you what we know. Again, a vast network of some major East Coast industrial capitals totally knocked out just after 4 o'clock Eastern Time this afternoon. And here in New York, we are coping with it with emergency generators, trying to get air to circulate and power to move through the wires that we have up and running. Detroit, Michigan, Toronto and Ottawa, Canada, Albany, New York, parts of the state of Connecticut, New Jersey, Akron, Ohio, to name some of the population centers hit by this. It is vast, it is history-making, all because we are told two of the great and combined venerable names in the state of New York history, the Mohawk Niagara power system was the first to go down. When it went down, the rest of the systems went out in short order, almost like a game of electronic dominoes. When one went, it did so with enough force, and the system is just old enough and carrying a modern-day load that was the chain reaction. Ashley Banfield remains outside the Today Show studios on the Plaza at Rockefeller Center in the center of this city. And Ashley, are you hearing any stories of people who have come out having either been trapped in elevators, subway cars, and the like?
A woman who actually walked down 60 floors just to get out of her building, not wanting to attempt the elevator. And we're hearing a lot of stories of people who've done that. We've not heard of anybody who was trapped in an elevator, but we've heard of people who heard people were trapped in elevators. It's very hard to know at this time. But what I do want to tell you, Brian, is that with all of the lights out in Times Square and throughout this city, there's a grave concern for a lot of the managers and the store owners in that area that they'll be looting later on. And so they're boarding up a lot of their stores and closing their stores and trying to protect against what might happen in another hour and a half when night falls throughout New York City. Also, a helicopter has been hovering over Times Square. It was too high for us to see whether it was NYPD or military, National Guard. We weren't sure, but clearly they were keeping a very close eye on the throngs, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who were not only overflowing the sidewalks, but clogging the streets as well. Traffic traffic police in Times Square were trying to just clear the people out of the streets so that cars, ambulances, and police cars could actually get through. It was quite a mob scene, but the surprising thing, most people taking it in stride, Brian. Very different scene than 9/11. Not the panic, not the fear, lots of confusion, but clearly most people just annoyed more than anything else. Brian?
Ashley Banfield from the Today Show Plaza, and perhaps we should go back to and help to explain that live picture and dwell for just a moment on how it is.
This is an NBC News special report. Here is Brian Williams.
It is only because of emergency generators that we are able to welcome you to our NBC News headquarters here in 30 Rockefeller Plaza in Midtown Manhattan, where the lights are out. For that matter, they are out west to Cleveland, Ohio, and north to Ottawa, Canada, in a huge and history-making blackout. This was the scene when the lights went out, and by that we mean street lights, we mean Wall Street, subways, everything in this financial capital at the height of summer tourist season, say nothing of the huge, for hundreds of miles, stretches of land affected by this tonight. The power went out shortly after 4 p.m. Eastern Time. There were fears of the very worst at first, given our new reality in this country, but quickly after that, we were assured it was a natural cause, as they say in the power business, a power grid, a big one that went out in the state of New York. The Mohawk Niagara, as it's called. If it sounds familiar, it was involved back in 1965 at the very start of the modern power era when it went out then as well. Tonight we are dealing with the approach of darkness, but so far in New York, the opposite of panic in the streets. In fact, New Yorkers doing what they do like no one else in the world, getting along in a crisis. You have seen all kinds of examples so far today of people helping total strangers out of a jam. Tonight they're helping each other out of the city. We have two correspondents.
The blackout of 2003. After a night without light, power still out for millions. Travel is very difficult. Phone service shaky. When will it end? No straight answers so far from officials. Why are we living with a power supply always on the edge of disaster? Complete coverage tonight, plus the story of the forgotten heroes of the war in Iraq.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather reporting from CBS News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. For much of the Northeast and parts of the Midwest, it was back to basics today. The sun providing the light, feet the transportation. Day 2 of the blackout of 2003. More than 4 million people were still without power from Massachusetts to Michigan and in Canada. Even as power is being restored slowly, neighborhood by neighborhood, the cause of the blackout remains shrouded in governmental and corporate gobbledygook. Congress announced an investigation. President Bush says it's, quote, a wake-up call that the U.S. electrical system is so antiquated. Phone service today in the blackout area was still disrupted. So was rail transportation. The airlines canceled more than 500 flights. CBS's Jim Axelrod begins our coverage.
On the morning after the worst power outage in the nation's history, the headline could be read a couple of ways. New York's mayor, for instance, was crowing.
Well, certainly a lot of people have been inconvenienced. We have a lot to be proud of this morning.
Why don't you wait another little bit?
The mayor clearly wasn't describing New York's airports, where inconvenience was actually industrial-grade chaos.
The airports are closed. Closed.
Actually, they weren't officially closed.
The entire fleet at the moment is grounded.
But they might as well have been. At LaGuardia, Christy Brown and her wheelchair-bound daughter Whitney, here from Florida to see doctors, were stranded.
She's fed by a feeding tube, and I have no more food, and I have no more medication for her.
But it wasn't just New York. 50 million people in the U.S. and Canada are thought to have lost power at one point or another. 1.4 million in the Cleveland area, 2.4 million in Metro Detroit, 3 million in Toronto.
How have you been able to cook pizza?
There are a million ways to add up the losses. 2 million in the case of the Broadway box office. Not to mention the millions not spent in restaurants, hotels, and businesses that closed in New York. While the shows will go on tonight,
Horrible. I waited
less time on 9/11.
The last 24 hours have been a reminder of conveniences taken for granted in America. Cell phones not working and drivers in gas lines for hours. Erica Fusu is a cabbie from Ghana.
I bet you didn't ever think in this day and age you could run out of gas in New York City.
Never. In Africa, yes, but here, no.
In Times Square, tourists thrown out of their powerless hotels slept on sidewalks. Same at the bus station, where Alicia Cruz cradled her 2-month-old.
So I'm just scared to go to sleep. I don't want my stuff to get taken.
And she wasn't the only one with problems.
Gotta go to the bathroom and you can't even go nowhere.
By today, for her and millions like her in the city, relief was hard to come by.
First time here, I can't wait to get out of here.
So while power is expected to be fully restored here in New York City by the end of the day, that does not hold for everywhere. In Detroit, for instance, they're talking Sunday before things are fully up and running. And in Toronto, it could be Monday before the subways are operational. Dan?
Jim Axelrod reporting live. Thanks. Power, transportation, food, phone service, gasoline, even water, all in short supply today in the blackout area. CBS's Jim Acosta reports how millions of Americans today were doing without.
In Cleveland, this city by the lake was out of water. People lined up at fire stations to find relief at the end of a hose. The National Guard deployed water tanker trucks to quench thousands of thirsts as the blackout shut down all 4 of the area's water pumping stations.
You can get along in the dark, you can get along in the heat, but water becomes a health and safety issue very quickly.
On the day after in Detroit, clocks were still stuck on blackout time, 4:10 p.m. Drivers stalled as the Motor City ran out of gas. This man hit empty while waiting in line to fill it up.
I've got to get down to my shop. Today's payday. I got to at least get in there and get the money.
We had people jumping in lines trying to get in front of other people who've been waiting for a while, and it's absolutely crazy out here.
It was no more sane across the border in Canada. Police say looters smashed storefronts in the capital city of Ottawa.
We were having some serious incidents. Fortunately, after that first set of problems, people generally behaved themselves very, very well through the rest of the evening.
Even powered-up airports from Minnesota to Miami felt the impact, comparing their delays to bad weather. In New Jersey, people see the blackout as a mystery. They can't figure out why some towns lost power for less than an hour, while others are still in the dark.
I have not had electricity since 8 o'clock in the evening.
Yet you live right around
3 blocks away, there's electricity.
Some are still asking why the power outages cost them their phone service. Telecom companies blame the widespread cell and landline failures on high call volumes and weak backup systems. The circuits, they say, were as busy as New York City bridges.
It's frustrating. You pay a good amount of money to use your phone, and you hope in a time of crisis that's when you'd need it.
And for many phone customers, when they needed it, they didn't have it. For them, no dial tone during a blackout isn't a phone outage, it's an outrage. Jim Acosta, CBS News, Englewood, New Jersey.
So we know what happened after the power failed, but we still don't know, well over 24 hours later, what happened first, what triggered the blackout. Cheryl Atkinson sorts through the facts, the theories, and some of the possibilities.
Even with the lights coming back on, customers remain in the dark about the cause and confused by conflicting reports. Officials now say the problems did not start in Canada, as some had claimed. Lightning, offered up as an explanation yesterday, has now been ruled out. The outage was not from a surge in demand from hot weather. And as hard as the federal government worked to rule out a terrorist tie yesterday,
I must emphasize that we'll continue to keep this possibility before us.
Michael Gent heads the industry group called NERC, which is leading the probe. He considers the chance of any kind of terrorism remote and has narrowed the list of possible causes to 2. Either a system design flaw or
some electric utility or operator was not playing by the rules.
The rules are ones that the industry adopted to keep the delicate balance of power. There's more electricity generated than lines to deliver it, so there's a constant fight to keep the lines from overloading. As long as companies follow the rules, there shouldn't be a blackout. But it turns out the rules are voluntary, with no real punishment for violators. Gent promises there will be no whitewash, no matter which way the finger of blame points.
We're going to get to the truth if there's a company that's responsible at the bottom of this, it'll be highlighted.
And they think they'll have a preliminary answer within days. The next question is, how did it get so out of hand, and where were the safeguards that were supposed to keep any blackout isolated to a small area? Dan?
Cheryl Atkinson reporting live from Washington. Whatever caused the blackout, it didn't take long. Apparently a few seconds were enough to start the cascade. Anthony Mason reports experts who've studied the aging U.S. power grid say the failure was not unexpected.
The power outages that swept across the Northeast yesterday didn't surprise the energy experts. They've been warning about them for years.
I went from region to region as Secretary of Energy and said, blackouts may happen.
New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson was Energy Secretary under President Clinton.
We've got a real crisis in our grid, and this is why, despite being a superpower, we have a grid that is comparable to a third world country, and that's not right.
Nearly 200,000 miles of high-voltage transmission lines deliver electricity across America. Over the past decade, energy demand has surged 30%, while transmission capacity is up only 15%. But analysts say the nation does not have a power shortage.
The system has more than enough power.
Energy consultant Hofstoffer says in most regions of the U.S.,
there's actually too much generation capacity.
The problem is inadequate transmission lines between the regions, creating huge bottlenecks. Those transmission lines haven't been upgraded because utilities must
spend money in West Virginia to reduce prices in New Jersey. Now, the people in West Virginia don't want to pay for that increased transmission capacity because it doesn't help them.
But the system is highly interconnected, so if a plant in one city is forced to shut down, it can cause a power surge in another city, will then also shut down. And the effect cascades through the system.
Yes, there's a fail-safe mechanism where plants, systems, and grids actually turn off rather than risk further damage.
And Carl Danner says that chain reaction can occur in the blink of an eye.
My understanding is the whole event took 9 seconds yesterday.
If it took just 9 seconds to lose power, analysts say it'll cost billions to upgrade the system.
My understanding is the whole event took 9 seconds yesterday.
If it took just 9 seconds to lose power, analysts say it'll cost billions to upgrade the system. But America shouldn't be in the dark about its energy crisis anymore. Anthony Mason, CBS News, New York.
Power was restored to the Wall Street area before the financial markets opened for business, but with many Wall Street workers taking the day off, trading was light. At the close, the Dow and the Nasdaq showed small gains. Later in this broadcast, we'll show you how the people of New York City are coping with their latest crisis. Power lines could be soon threatened on the southern Gulf Coast of Texas. Tropical storm Ericon is coming on fast. It's expected to be a hurricane when it makes landfall tomorrow. Now, a quick update on the blackout of 2003. Tonight, the power is coming back slowly. Still, more than 24 hours after it started, more than 4 million people were still without electricity. The affected area now extends from central Michigan to New York City. And the White House said tonight a joint U.S.-Canadian task force will be formed to determine what caused the power grid collapse. The blackout has been just the latest test for the people of New York City, who have seen more than their share of darkness in the recent past, a test of their toughness and their tenderness. CBS's Richard Schlesinger reports.
Even for New York, where it can be hard to define business as usual, the past 24 hours have been extraordinary. In the past, the mixture of high temperatures and no voltage has been explosive. The last blackout in 1977 brought on a cycle of looting and violence. This time the behavior was kinder and gentler.
Just chilling, bro, just enjoying it, loving it.
The people sleeping on the streets were not the people you usually see. With no electricity, tourists at one hotel became street people when their electronic key cards stopped working.
Hopefully we'll continue having a good time tomorrow.
And with nothing to power the trains, there was no need to rush through Grand Central Station.
At least I could lay here, talk to people. Everybody's really nice, making friends.
In the past, a citywide blackout was one of the worst things imaginable here. New Yorkers now know things can get much worse.
I think after 9/11, I mean, that's such a major blow to the city that people have just kind of been able to deal with adversity and have learned to kind of like roll with the punches, because that's a bigger deal than this could ever be. This is just a blackout.
So citizens took charge and, remarkably,
pedestrians, be patient.
Other citizens let them. I wanted to give you a chance to experience the new New York, if you will. We are in Times Square. Just listen for a minute. What do you hear a lot of? You hear a lot of traffic noise. What don't you hear a lot of? Honking. There's almost no honking in New York. It's as if the city that never sleeps has finally learned to at least take it easy. Richard Schlesinger, CBS News, New York.
New York, hanging tough and coming back. Bob Schieffer will be along Sunday with Face the Nation, and we invite you to tune in Monday to the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Good night.
For news 24 hours a day, log on to cbsnews.com.
How to prevent and treat your muscle injuries on the Saturday Early Show. Experience CBS News.